the loss is happening inside my body. Even with our miscarriages, the bleeding is happening inside or outside my body. Like it's a very physical um, action, physical experience for us. And our husbands are removed from that. They watch from the outside versus actually living in and experiencing it.
Are you walking through a storm that feels like it will never end? Do you wonder if life's storms have stolen the beauty from your life for good? You're in the right place. My name is Heather, and like you, I've been through a storm or two and wondered if life would ever be beautiful again. Here we share warriors' words, stories of discovering beauty after battles, and the worth in your wounds. Pick up your sword or boxing gloves and join the battle. Your words are powerful, my friends. Make them warrior words. Welcome, warriors. Jocelyn is back with us to talk about how miscarriage impacts families. So as a reminder, Jocelyn Abyad is the wife of Father Zyad Abyad and the mother of 7 daughters on earth and 3 babies in heaven. She holds a degree in psychology from Arizona State University and worked as a finance banker for over a decade before choosing to stay home and raise her children. Alongside her husband, she serves at St. John of the Desert Melkite Catholic Church in Phoenix, Arizona, where she is blessed to be close to family and longtime friends. Jocelyn shares insights on homeschooling and liturgical living across multiple platforms as Melkite Mama, and is a regular contributor to Busy Kids magazine. In 2024, she co-founded We Carry You Still, a nonprofit ministry offering support to women and families who have experienced miscarriage or infant loss. Through her work and personal experiences, Jocelyn's mission is to uplift and support those navigating grief while nurturing faith and community. But before we hear a little more from Jocelyn today, here is a review from Clutter Free. I love episode 45. I love this episode. It makes everyone stop and be grateful for life in the moment in time. I will have to say I am grateful for God. He is working through me and showing me so much. This is my season of intentional. Great job and keep up the good work. Thank you so much for recognizing the importance of gratitude, especially being grateful for God and what He is doing in your life. Would you like me to read your review on an upcoming episode? Go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review for the show. Who knows? I just might read your review next. And then after you leave your review, come and join us at the Warrior Words Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/warrior words. And as I mentioned in a recent episode, a friend pointed out to me that I invite you all to join my group, but I don't really say why you should join. So I designed Warrior Words as a community for women who have survived trauma and now want to thrive. As a woman designed in the image and likeness of God, you probably know intellectually that you are beautiful, but you may not see that beauty in yourself anymore for a variety of reasons. So this community was made for people like you and like me, who sometimes struggle with new traumas or how to find beauty in life situations. Women who want to thrive and see beauty in all of God's creations. Let's come together, supporting and encouraging one another in our struggles and learning to find beauty even in the toughest situation. Come join us. Now grab a tissue and join Jocelyn and me as we talk about how the death of a child through miscarriage impacts not only mothers, but the entire family. Let's rock. Welcome back to the Warrior Words podcast, Jocelyn. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you as well. It's good to be back.
Oh, well, thank you for coming because if you have listened to episode 70, I think it was episode 70, Jocelyn's first time here, we discussed her story. And at the end of that episode, um, we mentioned, or Jocelyn mentioned, that our husbands and our children may grieve differently, but that the incidence of a miscarriage impacts the entire family, not just the mother. And so I promised we would get Jocelyn back, and she is here, and I am thrilled that she was able to come back. So with that, um, I'll just remind everybody, if you haven't listened to episode 70, I would love for you to go do it. But Jocelyn shared her story of loss and miscarriage and how that literally or figuratively gave birth to We Carry You Still, which is a ministry for those who have child loss and experience miscarriage. So, with that, Jocelyn, can you maybe tell us? Let's go personal first. And if you could tell us, I believe, if I recall correctly, in two of the three incidences you shared with us, you had to share the information with your husband, but he was there with you for one of them. Am I remembering correctly?
Um, well, our very first miscarriage, I received the likely miscarriage ultrasound, had to go back to the doctor's office to confirm a week later. That was during COVID, and I did have to go by myself during that time and then convey it to him. Our second miscarriage was our earliest miscarriage. And so, again, just noticing the bleeding at home and then having to share with him. And then our third miscarriage, actually, our OB, my doctor, was the one to tell him. And because again, I had gone, it was much our latest miscarriage. And so we thought we were past any risk. And so I had gone to that checkup by myself as well. So, and that one was no follow-up, like out of the blue. We didn't have any warning kind of situation. So my OB, who honestly, I realized the other day I've known her for 13 years now. So at that point, maybe we'd known each other for 9 years. And she knew my husband, and she offered to make the call to have him come and help me get home.
Okay, so then once again, three very different scenarios. So
Yeah.
did did you have any, and maybe not, maybe this is an odd question, but did you have any expectation of how your husband should react to the news?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. One of the things that has shaped my view during that time actually happened quite a while before our miscarriages. We did have a period of 3 years of unexplained secondary infertility in the course of our marriage. And so we had two children already, and then we were trying to conceive our third, and nothing was happening. And so, for those who might have experienced infertility, they'll know how devastating of an experience that really is. It's just this roller coaster of every month hoping, every month being disappointed. Um, the anxiety of the days before, where you can't really know one way or another. And that was a really, really difficult time for me emotionally. And he seemed very neutral about the whole thing. And I was building up resentment for his lack of reaction when I felt like I was really suffering during this period. And then our dog passed away, and my husband loves his dogs and his pets, and he was really grieved by this loss of our family pet. And my family will tease me, I'm not the pet person in the family, so I don't have the same attachment. I don't wish them ill, but I don't have the same
Right.
attachment. And he was so deeply grieved by this, and I was just angry. I was so angry that he could show this emotion for this situation when in the other one he wasn't. But that opened the door for us at that point to have a conversation about how he was processing what was happening, how much more physical, um, and I don't know if I have a better word for that, but the loss is happening inside my body. Even with our miscarriages, the bleeding is happening inside or outside my body. Like it's a very physical um, action, physical experience for us. And our husbands are removed from that. They watch from the outside versus actually living in and experiencing it. So going into the miscarriages, we had, this foundation of this other really hard experience around our fertility, and being able to talk through that. And his feelings of disconnect to what I was experiencing very intimately within my own being. So I did have that foundation to know that we would necessarily grieve differently, but I will say in our miscarriages, I always felt very supported by him, and in many ways it brought us closer, and stronger, where I know that a lot of marriages can actually, separate. I feel like it goes either way, that it really drives a crack in relationship where cracks already exist, that water gets in and fills it even bigger. But in our case, and perhaps because we had that prior experience, we were able to kind of come together in that way. One of the things I was surprised by is I feel like in some ways he almost grieved later than I did. So in the moment, it was almost like we took turns, for lack of a
Okay.
better way to express it. But my grief was so big, in the beginning for each loss, that he took that protector, provider, um, guidance role for me, um, and allowed me to grieve. And then I found, even like on the anniversary of the baby's deaths and things like that, those were times where I found him to be more sad, um, perhaps because I was more at peace, then. So those are some of the differences.
Well, I find it interesting, both 2 points. The first one is that you mentioned how when you already have cracks in your marriage, maybe in totally different areas, that having a tragic event can cause that water, as you mentioned, to go through and make it crack deeper. But you also had that foundation of the experience prior. But I think even more important was you said it opened the door to a conversation. And so you had that opportunity and took the opportunity to communicate. And you learned a little bit more about how each other grieves and maybe even expressed more expectations of how you grieve versus how he grieves. And I think having that communication, that open door to communication, can sometimes prevent those cracks from deepening. Not to say that you
Yeah.
guys had cracks before, but I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect marriage, but
Yes.
two
Broken
imperfect
people.
people.
Yep. Exactly. Yes. Yes. And I think that's true. Absolutely, in marriage, in a woman's life, in a man's life, your preparation for trauma happens when you're not in trauma. And I do a lot of, not a lot, but I've done a few talks of how to homeschool through hardship. So at our local homeschool conference and in a couple other interviews. And really, one of my best pieces of advice is when you're not in hardship, you need to establish your community. You need to have a home parish that you are connected to, have a pastor that knows who you are. And when you build up that village, that proverbial village that everyone's always looking for, of support in the good times or in the more peaceful times, then when the trauma comes, you're able to fall back on all of those relationships that you've built, and that includes building better communication in your marriage, having those habits of prayer, habits of connection, to make sure you can withstand those trials. Because yeah, there's no marriage that's always sunshine and roses. There's no marriage that's always perfect or idyllic. It's highs and lows of life, just like everything else.
And I love that you brought up the homeschooling and hardships because I actually did an episode 72, right after yours, about that because you said something in that episode about having to homeschool your daughters through and after each of your miscarriages. And it reminded me of when I was in my own hardship, and it was the one thing I could keep consistent for my
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
And that
I enjoyed that
consistency.
episode. For the record, you gave good advice. So for all those other homeschool moms out there, go back and check that one out too.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, because you have to keep something. If every single thing in your world is topsy-turvy or upside down, your kids don't have anything to hold on to, and they need
Mhm.
some kind of stability, and just keeping one thing consistent when
Yeah,
you're going
for
through that
sure.
is so reassuring for them. Um,
Right.
and then the other thing that you said that kind of struck me as not odd, but it I was surprised by it was that you said you kind of took turns. But then as you explained it about how he rose as the protector and guider of your family, of you, and just really took care of you, that's my vision of how God designed the family to be and how God designed the husband-wife relationship to be. And it sounds like he just rose to that opportunity or rose to that challenge, that rose to the challenge. Is that the right phrase?
Yes, rose to the challenge. There we go. There we go.
um,
Yeah.
and that's a beautiful thing to hear that we do still have men in our society who are rising to that challenge and who are capable of doing that. It's despite what Instagram or other media will tell you, there are men who are capable of doing that, and it is part of God's design. But that
Yeah.
also, like you said, it doesn't negate his grief.
No.
And
Yeah.
and I got the impression that he didn't ignore his grief, but that in his love for his wife, he put you first.
Yeah, I think and all the gender roles gets very hot button and sensitive, nothing's politically correct anymore.
Right.
But if you look at the masculine virtues, those knights in shining armor and who are willing to die for those that they love, like true masculinity of sacrificial love. Our husbands, our men are called to be the spiritual leader of their families and to sacrifice for those that they love. And by being the wife, that doesn't make me subservient in being obedient. It actually puts me on a pedestal, is how I feel most of the time. I feel very provided for, taken care of. And when I talked to my husband too about his grief, I thought this was interesting and saw it to play out to be true. Like, I think a lot of women imagine they would like to see their husband cry or break down, like the sensitive man. But in truth, I actually think that a lot of times that breeds like insecurity in the marriage because what a woman really wants is to feel safe and safe enough to grieve when she is so broken down. And so, I mean, maybe it's a trivial analogy, but I almost feel like it's an umbrella. Like your husband is holding up the umbrella for you of this storm of life that's just coming down and gives you that space, that opportunity to grieve and to do what you need to do while he holds that umbrella for you. And inevitably that means he's getting wet and he's kind of taking on that onslaught, right? And I do think that's properly ordered. And he also expressed that and has found in his ministry with other men as well that men don't want to cry in front of their wives or in front of other women. Um, they're much more likely to grieve privately or with other men who understand the experience. So a man who's experienced miscarriage might be able to break down or really like process that grief in front of another man who has experienced miscarriage, but they're going to be very hesitant to express their grief in front of women in particular. Um, from that spirit of knighthood, from that idea that they love you so sacrificially, they don't want to put you in a position where you feel vulnerable. So I don't know if I'm expressing that clearly, but there's definitely an interaction there. And for me, I really liked, I think that's important for women to understand. I really liked going to retreats. There were a couple of like days of reflection and like, let's process your emotions. I wanted to talk to a counselor, and my husband was not very interested in like those types of events. That was not how he wanted to process his grief. It was much more a private experience for him. Versus me, I was seeking out, like I wanted to talk to other women about their stories. I wanted to hear it. Um, and I think that that speaks to that feminine way of grieving, and then the masculine way of grieving as well.
I think the analogy of the umbrella, the image that conjures in my mind is beautiful. I think that it illustrates that sacrificial love perfectly. Um,
Yeah.
so,
And
and
it
no, go
it's
ahead.
really plays out true. Like my husband will tease me, sometimes he'd be like, "Why do you love me?" Whatever. And I'll be like, "Oh, you're so handsome," or, whatever, something silly. But this wasn't too long ago that he asked me, "Why do you love me?" or whatever. We've been married a long time now. And I said, because you helped me bury our babies. And that's really true, is because, you can pick a lot of these highlights and you can pick a romantic proposal, because I had that too. And we've had a lot of, beautiful vacations and things like that. But now, in the maturity of our marriage, down the line, I love him because we could do the hard things together. And I have confidence that he'll take care of myself and my family.
If you're not watching on, if you're just listening, I got teared up there. It's kind of hard when you become speechless on an audio
Ah.
audio medium. But yes, that no that is beautiful. I mean, nobody wants to have tragic, traumatic experiences, but the truth is we all have them.
Mhm.
And to feel safe in your marriage that he's going to be there for you and take care of you and support you in that, he's truly living up to his vows. And it's just, we hear the media bash marriage so much. It is so
Mhm.
refreshing to hear that it does exist. It is real. It can happen.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
still believe that as a 50-some-year-old single woman. So
Yes. Yes. Society doesn't do us any favors, but marriage is really a gift from God, and it is a very sanctifying, humbling thing. It
mhm.
is not an easy thing, but yes, when both people are focused on Christ first and properly order their lives and their marriage, I think it's really a beautiful thing, and I feel very blessed to be living that out.
Definitely a blessing. So if we could switch just a little bit, I also wanted to talk a little bit about your children and how, you know, now they're all female. So
Yeah.
we talked a little bit about the way gender plays into this, but they were also all young. So how and varying ages too. So how did they process? Did they prefer to come to mom? Did they stay away from you because they knew you were grieving?
Mm.
What was it like more for them?
Probably, a mixture. Again, I actually asked some of the girls just recently in preparation for today, what do you remember about when Eden and Thomas and James died? What did you think about that? And interestingly enough, even a couple of them who had very, very strong reactions in the moment, and I remember that, were like, I don't really remember very much. But I'm glad they're in heaven, which I think is very true of children, right? They have very intense emotions in the moment and then they move on. And it really is just that simple. I think sometimes in scripture, it tells us to be like a child so that we'll enter the kingdom of God, right? And I think that's actually one of the things that God is talking about is that children very much live in the present moment. They don't worry about next month's bills or, whether or not they're developing appropriately, all these things that we worry about as moms, whether or
Mhm.
not they'll get into college when they're only two right now,
Yeah.
I mean, all these things that we project, but
Yeah.
children very much, live in that moment. And so their grief was intense in the moment. And now here, just 4 years later, it's really a pretty faint memory. Um, my daughter, who is 12 now, so she would have been 8 then, said, I remember you being really sad. And so I was a little sad, but I was mostly sad for you, which I think also speaks to, their connection to what they can see, and maybe that's even a similar connection like we talked about with husbands. So the woman in is the one really in that embodied experience, and everyone else is kind of these moving pieces around. So I definitely recall, and they also repeated that they really wanted to comfort me. So they would, give me hugs or come to me. But I was in a really dark place. Like I really had to grieve. And so I do remember times of just going into my room by myself. And again, we do have this incredible village. So people were bringing meals. Family friends were coming to play with them. My mom came over, my sister came over, read books with them. And so other people were able to step in. And because they were so connected, because we have such an amazing support system, for them, life was able to kind of continue as consistently as possible. Um, so those were some of the things that they recalled and expressed to me in the moment. And I think the other thing that was really important is that we were very candid with them about what had happened. I think sometimes, not sometimes, I think our society at large very much hides children from death. I think that's why we're so ill-equipped as adults to process death because we don't get a chance to process it as children when we can accept it and move on. We just get all these big feelings as adults, and we've never practiced grieving and losing people that we love. And so, again, when I mentioned that my husband and I had the opportunity to grieve before, my children we had these beautiful neighbors who were in their 70s, an older couple, and the wife loved to quilt. She gave them quilting lessons, and the husband was just a joy. Um, and we loved saying hi to them. If they were in the driveway at the same time as us, the kids are running across the yard to give them a hug, all these things. And they were also a faithful Catholic family. And so when Jack passed away, we were all very sad. But we actually got to visit him right before he passed, the day that he passed away. We got to visit him in the morning and say goodbye. We got to go to the funeral, and we got to talk to the children about a good death, that it is possible, that it can be beautiful, and that while we are very sad, that we have this confidence and this hope that Jack, Mr. Cummings, is in heaven praying for us. And so they had that opportunity to practice grieving someone that they love, and to do that before they lost their own siblings. So there was this foundation. And when I asked the girls again today, every single one of them said, I'm glad that our brothers and sister are in heaven. I'm glad that we have, that relationship with them. So that's their takeaway at the end of the day. They don't say, oh, that was really scary. Mom was sad and she spent too much time in her bedroom. Like, not one of them said, I remember being scared, or I remember how, that everything was messed up, when a lot of things were, not good, right? During that time,
Right.
but that's not their memory. Their thought is, I'm glad that they're in heaven, because they have that framework to talk about it, because they've had that practice. And we also didn't use language like we lost the baby. That can be really confusing to small children in particular. We didn't lose the baby. We know exactly where they are. The baby has died. I think it's really important to use that concrete language. And to just speak simply, so that they can truly process. Like we didn't lose the baby. We can't like go find them or follow them. They've gone someplace where we can't follow yet. And where are they? You know, what happened? We don't know why they died. I mean, those are some of the questions that they had. And we just really focused on giving them truthful, but simple answers.
I think that's an excellent point that I probably would not have thought of about just
Yeah.
the language of died versus lost. Because
Yeah.
from a child's mind, you lose your crayons, you look for them and you find them.
Right. Or can you
Yeah.
lose me? Can I
Ooh,
be lost?
oh,
Right? Because
yeah.
very much that child's mind and psychology is selfish, right? Is
Hmm.
self-focused, developmentally appropriately at a young age. So if my brother or sister could be lost, can I be lost too? You know, um, and those you really do have to be careful in your language choice, with the children. And I think that's why it's important to be clear again on your own theology, on what you do believe about what's happened to this baby. And if you don't know, to talk to your priest or your pastor so that you can be clear and really pass that clarity onto your children, because that is our job as parents. A lot of times, you know, common psychology advice is, you know, if your kid says, I'm scared about the boogeyman under the bed, then we say, okay, well, um, I'm sorry. Let's talk about how you feel about that. Let's look under the bed. Let's, you know, and feed into that, when in fact, the parent's job is to provide security and say, there's no such thing as a boogeyman. Mommy knows that you're safe. And a lot of times their question is looking for that security, is looking for clarity that they don't personally have yet. And you as a parent are to provide that clarity, because that provides safety and structure for them to heal and process what they're going through rather than feeding into their fears.
Wow. I was going to ask you at the end of this if you could give us some tips. And I think the entire time we have been talking, you have given us so many tips just with your own, like your own language choice, your own actions that you did with your children, that you lived and experienced with your children and your husband. I just think this whole thing is a giant gold nugget of
Ah,
of just practical. It's very practical advice that, like you said earlier, you said about going to have a plan like in times when you're not in trauma, when you're not walking through that storm, that's the time to prepare and the time to gather your people around you. And it's very, very difficult to do that in the midst of the trauma. And um, and so I think that's the best place to start. Now, I guess the one thing I would ask you is if you find yourself in that situation and maybe you don't have that parish family, or you don't have your, like you said, your sisters who came over, people who came to help you, if you don't have that as a resource, what would you suggest? Because I know I did not have very much of a parish family, and then I had to leave where I was and
yeah.
go live somewhere else at that time. So what would your advice be to someone who either wasn't able to or didn't think of building that structure
Yeah.
before?
I think this is actually a huge common problem in our society today, and in that American mentality. And you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And we're very individualistic, in our societal structure. So I think a lot of people find themselves in that position. And I think the first answer is to cling to Christ, right? To put your needs to prayer, because God is the ultimate provider, and to put your needs in front of Him. But I do think also, the next step, I mean, if you're completely ignorant, is to go to those online resources, ministries like We Care You Still, there are online support groups for all different types of hurts and traumas. So to seek out those online communities to tap into some of those resources, and then often that will lead to the local connection. So again, in our example, we hope that people will find We Carry You Still, and then those that are in Phoenix will be able to come to our events. We'll be able to receive a box. We'll be able to have that hand to hand. And then more colloquial, I suppose, is I really feel that our friends in the world, our neighbors, our fellow parishioners in our pews who are, let's say, 65 and over, are really an untapped resource in our world today. And by that, I mean, most of the time their children are already grown and they have a little bit more free time on their hands. Even if they're working, then their evenings are perhaps less occupied. Those of us who are still in the midst of, raising little kids, we've got the soccer games and we've got whiny toddlers and we've got naps and, all these other pressures and obligations that can make it hard or harder to show up for other people. But that 65 plus crowd can be incredible babysitters, can be incredible cooks, can be incredible sources of wisdom, can be company. And a lot of times they have that to give. And I would argue that they really want to give it as well. How many of our particularly elderly people express like deep loneliness, deep sadness? They don't have those connections with others, and we know spiritually, psychologically, that giving to others is really edifying. And so I think that's really a great opportunity to seek those kinds of folks out. And truly, it might be the lady who just always smiles at you in your pew on Sunday and be like, "Hey, I'm really struggling and I need help." And I think that's really hard to do, but I think if we can identify those folks who you see them at the grocery store every week, or you see them in your pew at church every week, and just ask, I think we would be surprised how many people are willing to show up and to help and are available and desiring to help others.
It's like your neighbor Jack.
Yeah, truly, truly. I tell people all the time, they changed my life. They really did because Jack taught us what a good death was. Um, and interestingly enough, and you talk about like elderly people who can be good to you. She used to make bread for us, and I would make soup, and then I'd bring her some. She would have dinner with us occasionally, and she gave my kids sewing lessons every week. So they had these really beautiful friendships with them. But I thought Jack was just a kind old man. And then when I went to his funeral, I found out that he was like a decorated war hero, had been a spy in Germany for America, had done all of these amazing things in his life. But to be honest, I never knew anything about it. But I knew that he loved me and he loved my family. And on the day that he died, our street has never been more full of cars. It was just lined with his children and his grandchildren and friends that came to pay their respects. And that forever changed me. That's what I want. I want on the day that I die, I want this street filled with cars of people who loved me and that I was able to touch their lives and they touched mine. And I don't need any of the medals or accomplishments. I need that love and that connection.
That's what we were made for.
Yeah,
Made for
amen.
love. Yes.
Amen.
So, and I think that's the perfect place to end this conversation. I thank you for all of your tips that you sprinkled through here, even though you didn't itemize them as 1, 2, and 3. There were they are sprinkled through. And so if you missed one, go back, rewind, and listen to her again. So I want to thank you for giving your time to us, not once, but twice, sharing your babies with us, all of them, sharing your husband and your marriage with us, and just being a blessing. I appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you and I appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Eden, Thomas, and James. I remind you of these beautiful children whose lives not only impacted Jocelyn, but her husband and her daughters as well. This conversation was so enlightening for me, and I hope it was for you as well. I think one of the things to remember in grief is that we all grieve differently. There are differences in between the genders and differences in ages. And when we are actually in the moment of grief, that is sometimes difficult to remember. Jocelyn touched on communication, having conversations with your spouse about grief, because in reality, it's inevitable. You will face grief at some point during your marriage, and the two of you will likely handle it differently. But if you have an understanding in advance of how each of you grieves before it happens, that can help you prepare. Likewise, she mentioned that it's important to build that support system before the storms begin. You can do this in your family, your neighborhood, and even your church. You can even do it using online resources, which can then lead you to local ones. And she gave the beautiful example of We Carry You Still. They have online resources that you can use no matter where you are. And then they have local support for you if you are in the Phoenix area. And I think this resonates or rings true for a lot of online support systems. So it can be for whatever storm you're walking through. You can likely find an online resource, an online community, and then they can direct you to local resources for you. So, and who are those people who can be those local resources, who can be like Jack and his wife were to Jocelyn and her family? Do they live on your street? Do they sit behind you in church? And I loved her observation of that untapped resource of the older generations around us. What a beautiful relationship it creates when someone can teach your child a new skill, or when you can exchange meals with each other, or simply be there for each other when one of you is walking through a storm. It's one of those mutually beneficial relationships. I think the most beautiful image Jocelyn brought to this conversation was that of the knight in shining armor, not using his sword, but his umbrella, standing out in the rain while he faithfully covers his wife, his lady, providing consolation, space, and recognition, while sacrificing his own warmth and comfort. And all of that is done from love, with love, and for love, all based on God's example, because God is love. Now, I know this was an episode based on family members grieving through miscarriage in different ways, the intensity of a child's pain in that moment, the more silent grief of a husband. But Jocelyn gave us something more than that. She gave us an example of the sanctifying love of marriage, of a marriage lived the way God intended and rightly ordered. Jocelyn and her husband both grieved the deaths of their children. They grieved in different ways, but they also demonstrated their love for each other by allowing that grief to draw them closer together. They allowed their storm to solidify their bond as husband and wife. And they gave us a beautiful example in the process. So can you recognize a time when someone held the umbrella for you? Or how can you hold the umbrella for someone else? Something to think about this week. Until we meet again, armor up, fight the good fight, seek beauty, and make your words warrior words. God bless.